everybody. Glad to have you on this session of our class. Over the course of the last number of weeks, we have covered a variety of subjects. We talked about longevity, we talked about intentionality, we talked about verbal fraud, we've talked about all sorts of kinds of things. And in each session, I hope that what we get to do is a couple of things, right? That we get to learn a little bit about how Talmud functions. We learn about how the words work, why they might be framed a particular way. That we understand what's happening in the Talmud, just in terms of how the rabbis have constructed their discussion. And that we've walked away with something meaningful. That really matters, certainly to me. And I want to just take this opportunity to remind you that while there are legal components of the Talmud, certainly it is a framework in which the rabbis are engaging in this discussion. The Talmud is not just a law book. It is a storybook, as we've discovered. It's a collection of advice, as we saw. It is a investigation of a particular concept or idea and how it impacts people in real life, right? So when we talked about verbal fraud, about the way that we use language, it wasn't just about the words we use, but it was about its impact. We might be stealing someone's time. We might be harming. We might be disrespectful to someone. We might be harming who they are. There are a lot of ways that these concepts really manifest in real life. Today, we're going to talk about something a little bit more esoteric, if you will. Actually, before I do that, I'm putting in the chat for those who are interested. This is a link to the playlist on YouTube of all of the classes thus far. So if you missed one, you can watch it. If you want to review, it's there. If you don't, you just want to send it to a friend, that's cool too. And we thank the Shul, B'nai Yeshurun, for putting those recordings up. Of course, this being a B'nai Yeshurun class, even though everybody is welcome. Today, we're going to talk about a subject we often float around, we often sort of discuss around the idea, which is, what are the consequences of our mitzvot? Is there a reward for that? How does it impact our understanding of the world to come, or not, as the case may be? And that's the subject we're going to talk about today, which is, what happens when you perform a mitzvah? What benefits are there? And what happens when that isn't the case? What does that look like? So we've got a few pages of Talmud we'll investigate together. We certainly will spend the next few sessions unpacking it. And as crazy as this is to sound, the high holidays are not so far away. And so it's good for us to start to get ourselves in the right mental place, even as we approach Elul in short order. I like to think of Tisha B'Av as the beginning of that journey, as opposed to the end of the year, if you will. So with that, unless there are any questions, I'd love to dig into this week's, or at least the beginning of this week's deep dive, if you will. Any questions, concerns, thoughts, sermons, counter sermons? Wonderful. All right, let's dig in. So I'm going to share my screen here. Give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Yes, amazing. Awesome. So we are studying from Masechet Kiddushin, which on page 39b, and the section will go to 40b. So sort of a full daf and some change, if you will. And this Kiddushin ostensibly is about relationships. It's about the way we enact marriages. Now, obviously, this section is not about that, but that is the broad context of Masechet Kiddushin, and so this is a sort of a detour from that subject. I'd love a volunteer to read the Mishnah, if you want to use the raised hand function, which is under reactions. Just as a reminder that the Mishnah is a Tanaitic source. It is an early rabbinic source from the first, second centuries or so, and is considered quite authoritative. The Talmud, as you might recall, is a combination of the Mishnah and the Gemara. The Mishnah is our sort of starting place of discussion, and then the Gemara sort of expands and explores that subject. Bill, why don't you start reading for us right here where it says, anyone who performs.
Anyone who performs one mitzvah has goodness bestowed upon him. His life is lengthened, and he inherits the land, i.e., life in the world to come. And anyone who does not perform one mitzvah does not have goodness bestowed upon him. His life is not lengthened, and he does not inherit the land of the world to come.
Amazing, thank you. So I want to say two things right off.
The first question that comes up is if someone does a chait, does he get a negative, or is that a completely separate category and you get a punishment, but it doesn't shorten your days?
Yeah, so let me come back to that, because sin does come up in this discussion. So like, hold on to it, right? We're going to come back to it. So I want to say one thing right off the bat, which is in this version of the Talmud, as in many versions, it defaults like the grammar itself into a male voice, right? His life, his land bestowed upon him. And so I want to just sort of remind us as modern readers that we should understand certainly these texts as referring to individuals regardless of gender. And so I generally try and translate them to read them in sort of a gender neutral way. It's hard to do that when the text is there. So I want to just encourage us to have that in mind as we read this section of Talmud. When I translate on my own, I often try and like pull out that stuff. So I want to just start off and put that there. Second, let's like unpack this. Ron's already sort of jumped in, but let's unpack this, right? We've got two statements that seem to be opposite of one another, or sort of inverse of one another. First, anyone who performs one mitzvah, right? Kol ha'oseh mitzvah achat, goodness is bestowed upon that person. Their life is lengthened, and they inherit the land. Now, Rabbi Steinsaltz, right? The bold is the translation, and the not bold is Rabbi Steinsaltz's commentary. Rabbi Steinsaltz defines for us that the land refers to life in the world to come. So already we're taking a departure from the literal text of the Talmud itself, okay, or the Mishnah itself. The inverse of the first statement is anyone who does not perform one mitzvah does not have that goodness bestowed upon them. Their life is not lengthened, and we do not inherit, that person does not inherit the land, or that is to say, of the world to come. And so let's just sort of unpack a bunch of questions here. So Ron already started. Does not performing a mitzvah equal a sin, right? That's one question. Let's just sort of ask a bunch of questions. Nelson, I know your hand has been up for a while, so I'm going to come to you, and then Bill Satin.
Perform, does it require intent?
Nice, bringing the two classes together. I love it, right? So does intent matter here?
Because I would say that, is there anybody in the universe who doesn't perform one mitzvah? I mean, there's just hundreds of mitzvahs. Surely by accident you performed, gone through the action of doing a mitzvah.
Right, so we have actually a couple of questions in there. One, right, being is, what does it mean to perform? Does it require intention? Second, what do we mean by one mitzvah? Right, as long as I don't murder someone, does that mean I fulfilled one mitzvah? Right? Well, how do we define that? Great, those are good questions. Bill, what else are we asking?
Well, goodness has a range of goodness. Life lengthening has a range, at least as of right now. It's binary. You're either in the world to come or not. So I find that an interesting start here. Perhaps later they'll talk about, well, you might be on the lowest level or the highest level in the world to come, but that's a whole other story. But the antithesis, I don't want to call it an antithesis. I think there's something very calming about the second portion, because if it was only the first statement, then one might infer, oh my gosh, if I don't perform that one mitzvah, again, I might select 612 I don't want to do, but if I don't perform it, not only might goodness not be bestowed upon me, but perhaps badness will be bestowed upon me. And yet, and perhaps my life not only won't be lengthened, but it might be shortened. Because there is a range for those, that's a possibility. The binariness of life in the world to come doesn't offer that. And so we get clarity in the second portion, maybe, that, hey, even if you don't do a mitzvah, you might not get goodness bestowed upon you, but it doesn't say the wrath of God will fall upon you. It doesn't say your life will be shortened, but because of the binary choice here, it does say, sorry, Charlie, you're out of luck in the world to come. I guess there weren't too many other options. So in this world, your life isn't necessarily diminished with lack of goodness and lack of length. It's just not enhanced. So
Right,
that's
so-
yeah, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I would say, just to sort of summarize, right, that this frame, if it was only alone, the first part, we might assume that there's positive and negative. But the existence of the second and its framework, according to the framework you're presenting, is there's a neutral, which is life is normal, let's say, right? And that if you do a mitzvah, it's good. And if you don't, you're at normal, right? You're not necessarily at negative, right? So we're starting to get a sense, it's not even really a binary. We've got like a trinary situation going on, right? Where we've got positive, neutral, and negative. It's like electrons, neutrons, and protons, right? That there's a range.
Well, there is only binary for the land, for the world to come. You're either in it or you're not. There's no neutral
Right.
that way. So in this world, there's a neutral. In the world to come, you're either with us or you're against us.
Yeah, right. So here we have it. I hear what you're saying. It doesn't offer us potentially another place where we might end up, right? Or are we talking about the verb inherit? Maybe inherit has multiple meanings. Again, I'm not suggesting the Gemara is going to respond to all these questions, but just sort of like to get our brain juices going. Ron and then Sheila.
There are two places, at least there's two different I guess it's places, two places in the Torah where it talks about your days would be lengthened and you I can't remember the whole thing, but one is shooing away the mother bird and the other one is honoring your parents, is it?
It is.
Yeah, so is that part of this? Is it talking about the same thing, or is that something completely different? Is that in this world or the next world?
Yeah. So I want to say two things. One is the Gemara absolutely makes reference to those two things. So I'm not going to speak to it, but yes, those are good questions. And I would make also the distinction right here, at least in the text, that one's life being lengthened and inheriting the land are not equivalent, right? And so we have some pieces there to sort of unpack. Sheila and then Nelson. Sheila, you are muted.
It may be roughly the same thing as Ron is saying. Who performs one mitzvah, which says to me, one is a question, knowing it's Talmud. Okay, and mitzvah, what's a mitzvah? What's the, is there a category of mitzvot, which is, as Ron was saying, that is one better than another?
Right. So we've got the definition of like, how do we define one mitzvah? And second, how do we define a mitzvah as a part of that? And are the levels?
And also, if you think about it, one, is this one mitzvah at one time and you're covered for the rest of your life?
Right. What's the statute of limitations on my one mitzvah? Right.
For how long? I mean, we talk about this a lot in secular world, that, you know, if you do one mitzvah, if you give charity once, does that take care of you forever or not?
It's a great question. Nelson and then Ron, and then we're going to read on.
Well, there's a kind of contradiction. If my life is lengthened, then it's going to take me longer to get to the world to come. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's Hamlet's question.
Right. I love that.
So
Yeah, that's a great. I've never thought of that before. That is a great question. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good piece of the puzzle.
Well, your life is on and lengthened here in conjunction with goodness being bestowed upon them. So you're actually being given longer period with more goodness. So in a way, it's not a bad thing, right? If in the second half of it said, hey, we're going to give you bad stuff and make you live longer, all of a sudden, it would be a double whammy. So just a thought.
Yeah. These pieces are all interconnected. Ron, and then we're gonna move on.
I'll try to keep this short. The landscaper's outside making a lot of noise. I was wondering, I'm trying to separate positive mitzvot from negative mitzvot because it's kind of hard to perform a negative mitzvah. You don't perform a negative mitzvah, you just don't do anything. So is that is that a different category?
That's not necessarily so.
Go say more, Sheila.
I don't know, if you don't perform a mitzvah, that doesn't mean that it's, I don't know, it's, say it again, Ron.
I think what Ron is saying is, right, positive mitzvahs are like the kum va'aseh, like to get up and do something. And the negative mitzvot are don't do things. So as long as I don't murder, right, I'm consistently in fulfilling the mitzvah of not murdering.
You're fulfilling it, but you haven't performed it. To me, performing is an action.
Yeah. So the verb here is la'asot, to do, right? And so we have to ask, what does it mean? Maybe it means only the kum va'aseh, the positive mitzvot, right? The ones where you have to get up and do something. It's not clear from the Mishnah, certainly. Let's move on. Let's move on. Can I get another volunteer to read this first paragraph of the Gemara? And I'll point out that this term uraminhi is another one of those objection words. A lot of the paragraphs begin. It almost always refers to bringing a contradiction as a quote from somewhere else. So it's not just a contradiction or an objection. It's almost always bringing it from somewhere else, and often a Mishnah, which is what we see here. Jackie, please. You are muted, so why don't you unmute there? I know it's hard on a mobile device. Can I hit the ask to unmute? Maybe that will help.
Here we go.
Nice job.
Okay.
Right here.
And the Gemara raises a contradiction from a Mishnah. Pay 1, these are the matters that a person engages in and enjoys their profits in this world, and the principal reward remains for him in the world to come. And they are honoring one's father and mother, acts of loving kindness, hospitality toward guests, and bringing peace between one person and another. And Torah study is equal to all of them. This indicates that one is rewarded in this world only for fulfilling these mitzvot, but not for fulfilling all mitzvot.
Amazing. Thanks, Jackie. So you might recognize this text. It shows up often in, especially if you use the Sim Shalom or the Lev Shalem, it shows up in the morning rituals around, right, often following the bracha for Torah study, right? La'asok b'divrei Torah, we study Torah, and then it gives us often a quote of Torah, of Mishnah and Gemara, and often this is the Mishnah that's quoted. Not always, not in every Sidur, but certainly some. And we have this relatively famous section of Mishnah. If you've never heard it, that's okay. Today is that day. So Elu devarim sha'em ochel perotehem ba'olam hazeh. These are the things that here it translated says a person engages in and enjoys their profit. In the Hebrew, it's translated as these are the things that a person sort of eat. They eat their fruits in this world, and at the end in the world to come. Meaning to say, they engage in them here, and then they get the benefits later. But I love the imagery of eating them as fruits. These mitzvah are fruits, and they are honoring one's parents, acts of love and kindness. So kivud avein, gemilut chasidim, acts of love and kindness. Hachnasat orchim, welcoming guests. Vahavat shalom ben adam lechavero, bringing peace between people. And then the conclusion, Talmud Torah keneged kulam, right? And Torah study is equal to all of them, is sort of compared to all of them. Meaning to say, if there was a scale, Torah study would be on one side and everything else would be on the other. And so here, the rabbis are asking the question, saying, okay, well, what does one mitzvah refer to? And the Gemara, at least this objection, is saying it doesn't refer to all the mitzvot. We've got proof. From this section of Mishnah, it refers to this one because it talks about the world to come. You do them and you get the benefits. So honoring one's parents, acts of love and kindness, hospitality, peace between people, and Torah study. So it's not all mitzvot. It's just one of these five. All right, let's see what the rabbis do with this. Can I get another volunteer to read for us?
I'll read if no one else will.
Great. And then Sheila, Sheila, you read, and then Nelson, I saw you too. You'll read the next one.
Okay, Rav Yehuda said that this is what the Mishnah is saying. Anyone who performs one mitzvah in addition to his other merits, and thereby tips the scale of all his deeds to the side of righteousness, has goodness bestowed upon him, and is compared to one who fulfills the entire Torah. The Gemara asks, one can learn by inference from here that with regard to those mitzvot listed in the Mishnah in Peah, one is rewarded even for one of them, notwithstanding the fact that overall his sins are more numerous. Rav Shmaya said, the other Mishnah serves to say that if one's sins and merits were of equal balance, that is, he has accrued an equal amount of merit and sin, one of these mitzvot tilts the scale in his favor.
Amazing.
My question.
Sure.
That it's when they say one mitzvah, question is, how long are you doing this? Honoring your mother and father? For how long do you have to do these things? The implication is that Torah study is equal to them all. In other words, you have to keep doing them. It's one mitzvah, but it's not one mitzvah that's done once.
So it doesn't.
It doesn't say it, but it's yeah.
Let's unpack this section of Gemara. But I think it's a good question. So first is we have different opinions here. Rav Yehuda comes and says, "Hachi ka'amar," this phrase right here, which is the Gemara saying that the person who says it is sort of defining terms. This is what it means. Hachi ka'amar. This is what the Mishnah is saying. That anyone, right, who performs one mitzvah, right, in addition to their other merits, right, if they're a good person, they're kind, they're friendly, whatever, they get the sort of all the benefit. It's compared, right, to one who fulfills the entire Torah, right? So Torah study keneged kulam. We can see here this little note. Let's take a look at what the note says. This is the beauty of having these pages here. I think I want to make sure I've quoted the right note here. Performs one mitzvah, but that's halacha. Here's notes. This issue is also discussed in the Yerushalmi, which suggests that the statement refers to an individual whose merits and sins are equally balanced, which is what it says later on in the paragraph. Another possibility presented here is that the individual is highly meticulous with regard to a particular mitzvah, which that person never transgresses. So we've got a couple of things. So meaning to say, Rav Yehuda, if we look at that view, is saying, in addition to all the other good stuff and mitzvot that this person does, this person is super passionate about one mitzvah. And because they perform that mitzvah at this high level, right, it's as if they've benefited from the whole thing. So that's one question. That's one opinion. The second, the Gemara comes and says, right, well, it's really about these five, and that one of them is enough, right? That even if you were pretty sinful in all your other ways, but you did one of these five, that was enough. So if we've got this barrier, this threshold for the world to come, right? We're like lowering that threshold. It doesn't matter if you are doing all sorts of other things. If you do one of these 5, then you've crossed the threshold. So that's the second view. And the third view is Rav Shemaya, who says, actually, what the original Mishnah means is that if your scales are balanced, one mitzvah is enough to tilt the scale. It's one mitzvah is enough to put you into the positive accounting of this sort of metaphysical accounting of sort of whether or not you get the reward at the end of the day. Nelson, I saw you put your hand up.
Well, I'm bothered a lot by how much you have to do. If you read one verse of Torah, is that enough? Or is Torah some study you have to have some things you do in your life? And in the same way, all your life you've got to honor your mother and father and do deeds of loving kindness and offer hospitality towards guests and try to bring peace. And related to all that, I'm wondering if you can honor your mother and father all your life. I'm not sure. Once they're deceased, I'm not sure what you do to honor them.
Oh, yeah.
Those are good questions. Yeah. Sheila?
Well, there's also a question. I mean, the old, it's sort of like a joke, but they always talk about the people who, the slum landlord who is meticulous in keeping Shabbos.
Say more.
Well, I mean, where does this fit in? And I mean, there's a case New York Times is writing about one of them in New York.
Yeah, right.
Kicking people out of their homes. And yet, he's supposedly an Orthodox Jew, complete with the, having pictures with the kippah on. And this is always a question when people talk about Orthodox people, they love to bring up this example, that they.
Well, so I want to make a really important distinction between observant and Orthodox. And I also want to be careful not painting Orthodoxy with a broad brush. So I want to just be really careful there. Right. So the principle being, right, which is
someone who's super observant.
Right. If you are halakhically observant, but you're doing all these bad things, is that even, does it count, as it were? Is that enough? Bill Satin.
Yeah, our assumption here is that we are to take what they're saying at face value, meaning the words they're saying are the exact intent that they're trying to convey to the readership, whoever that is. We've seen enough in Mishnah in particular where there's exaggeration of ideas or concepts to drive home points. So my sense of all of them is, we're not going to talk about a lower limit. We're only going to try to define some motivation at either a high level or a workaround or whatever it may be, just to hope that anyone reading this might become a little bit better person. They might not reach every goal. They might not be 100% what, every mitzvot, but by setting the example or the bar at a high level, we give them, they think they're giving a motivation for people to work toward. Now, we know if you set the bar too high, if you have a child and the room is only cleaned if everything is put away 100%, that could become a negative for children. And I think we've seen that in our culture, and we've seen that as Jews, that sometimes we struggle with, if this is what we're supposed to do at the highest level, and we can't be at the highest level, then poof, we're out of here. But that's how I read all of this, or each finding their own way of defining how far can they put the carrot away from the horse and still get them to walk.
Yeah, so I think it's really valuable. We've very much approached these 3 paragraphs in a very legal focused way, right? What are the boundaries? What box do I have to check, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's really valuable for us to sort of step back and say, okay, what are the principles that we can draw from this, even if it's not in a legalistic way? Meaning to say, right, like the rabbis are interested in respect between people and kindness and peace and Torah study. That those are principal values, whether or not it's one Mishnah or 2 Mishnahs or a whole book of Torah notwithstanding, right? The question of what is it that we want from people, right? According to Peah, and in this context, it might be we really just want people to be out there being kind and respectful and hospitable and peace seeking, right? And we have this discussion of like what's enough, right? We are as human beings, we say, at least in our tradition, right? We have the Yetzer HaTov and the Yetzer Hara, these inclinations to do things that we shouldn't do, or that are not of our highest ideal. What as a human being, if I fall trap of this nature of humanity, does that mean I can never regain whatever benefit the world to come seems to be? And again, one of the questions we didn't unpack is what the hell does that even mean? What is the world to come even defined as? And then I think, Bill, you make an interesting point, right? Which is, what's the goal of the author and the reader? If we're the reader, what are we supposed to take from this, right? Is the Gemara going to set an unattainable goal, right? Especially if we have these sort of various levels of meticulousness when it comes to mitzvot. And I'll give you a great example that I've been thinking about a lot as sort of these levels, right? When we celebrate Hanukkah, right, we are enculturated now to a very specific level. So that the culture that we live in is one in which we light, all the different candles on Hanukkah, and everybody lights their own menorah. But if you look at the Gemara and the halachic texts, if you light a single candle on Hanukkah, you have fulfilled the obligation. Then there's a level, Mahadrin, right? Those people who want to beautify the mitzvah, they're going to light the Chanukiah. And then there's the Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin, the people that everybody lights 8 candles, or whatever, however many candles that night. Right? There are these sort of, I hate to say levels because they're all right, and they're all right, and none of them are wrong. But that there are these, we have this desire in our tradition to beautify the mitzvot. And so the question is, like, how far along is that? What is our relationship to it? And here it would seem to say, I would argue, that we're not looking for Mahadrim Mina Mahadrim. We're not looking for the highest quote unquote level. We're looking for engagement of mitzvot, these qualities. And again, this is not the end of the discussion. It's quite a bit longer, and we'll unpack it. Jackie and then Eric.
Okay, one of the things that I seem to get as from all of this is when the question was asked, well, how long do you do it? I think they're intended to be a life's work. So you have a whole life in which to try to do each of these mitzvot. And maybe at one point in your life, it's difficult to do, but perhaps in another part of your life, it becomes a way of life, and it gets comfortable enough so that you can do it. And you always have the opportunity during a lifetime of honoring these mitzvot at different times. So you have a lifetime in which to do this, because it's not time bound.
Right. I love your use of the word time bound, right? That we're actually, right, this halakhic concept, which would argue that things are deeply time bound, are also part of life's work. I love that framing. I would even add, right, that some mitzvot are not possible unless you've reached a certain context, right? In some cases, it's a geographical one. In some cases, it's a resource. Whatever it is, sometimes we can only fulfill the mitzvot when a particular context, right? Can't fulfill Sukkot unless it's Sukkot, things like that. So I love that.
You don't always have guests, so that you may not be able to invoke hospitality unless you have a guest to do it with.
Exactly right. Again, we get asked the question, okay, well,
and you have 2 people arguing, then you have an opportunity to bring peace between them. But you can't go to people and say, go fight with each other so I can get a mitzvah. So
maybe we can. We probably should. Eric and
not a good idea.
Okay, you mentioned Sukkot. So I do remember pretty vividly, you build a sukkah, and you go out there every night, and before the meal, there's some things you say, and one of them is that by virtue of my fulfilling this mitzvah of building the sukkah, may I have getting credit for have the merit of having fulfilled all 613 mitzvot. So that I do remember that being there. I'm not sure how that fits into all this, but that's simply essentially build sukkah, and we're asking for credit, so to speak, for all the other ones.
Yeah, so I love that, right? The hine muchan, right? I'm here prepared to fulfill the mitzvah.
Yeah, that part.
Yeah, so I think it's a couple of things happening at once that I think are really valuable. One is a recognition that the Talmud is not particularly internally consistent. Like, it doesn't agree with itself all the time. In fact, Dafka, it disagrees with itself constantly. And so that what we're seeing are various threads of Judaism interwoven together, right? And it might be that the Rav who wrote that intention really thinks Sukkot is like the most important mitzvah, where in Peah we have a different one. Again, I'm not suggesting that one set of mitzvah is more important than another, but rather that there are many ways in, and that there are many ways of feeling like you're fully in it, right? That whole value of it's as if you fulfilled the whole Torah, right? Torah study as a way of engaging with everything all at once, right? And so I think that is an important piece of the puzzle as well, right? That we're seeing lots of threads interwoven together, and we're seeing some perspectives, and it doesn't seem like Rabbi Yehuda and Rav Shmai would agree with each other here in this paragraph, but we have both because both have value. Ron, give us the last word, and we're going to move on to the next paragraph.
I got lots of last words this time. Number one, of the 613 mitzvot, there are a huge number of them that are dependent on living in the land. There's a huge number of them that are dependent on there being a temple, and obviously, at least those of us in the diaspora can't perform. That's number one. Number two is there are a large number of them that are time bound, and therefore, forgetting about egalitarianism, aren't incumbent upon women. And then I think there's a different value associated with those that you have to do as opposed to ones that are kind of optional. That the ones you have to do have a higher level. The ones that you're commanded to do have a higher level than those that you do just because you feel like it. And then I have the question that I asked in the chat: what is meant by Torah study? Is Torah study the 5 books, the entire canon? Does it include the Talmud? Does it include the Mishnah? I'm sorry, does it include the Mishnah? Does it include the Gemara? Does it include any books after that? What is Torah study? Because Torah just means instruction. What instruction is included in Torah study? There, I guess I just loaded on you. So have fun with it.
So I want a few things. So I think that there's a reason why we use Torah in both narrow and expansive ways, right? We use it to refer to specific things like the 5 books of Moses. We also use it in ways to refer to the entire endeavor altogether. And I think the rabbis use it that way. So that Talmud Torah is about the engagement in Torah, right? It is the limud of Torah, if you will, as opposed to a definition of saying we're talking about these X, Y, and Z verses. So I think that's the first thing. Second is we can have a much broader conversation about the nature of time-bound and obligation and who is obligated to those. I'll certainly share my own view, which is that I believe that Jewish adults, regardless of gender, are equally obligated to time-bound mitzvot. And that might be a conversation for another session, since I certainly don't want to dig into it today. But there is a thread in the Talmud that and before that seems to make a more complicated views of time-bound. The language is not clear in the Talmud. In fact, often they use time bound and then they start making exceptions immediately. And so that concept is useful, but it is very flawed. So that's the second thing. The third thing, I think, is that the question of sort of what are we doing and why are we doing it is embedded in this conversation, which is, it would seem to say, from what we've learned thus far, is that the purpose, the engagement of what we're doing, regardless of which mitzvah we define, is about some sort of reward of this world to come, this benefit, this goodness and long life that we experience. And at the same time, we know, even though it's not here, that the rabbis are much more concerned about what we do in this world. And so we have a bit of an internal contradiction here about what's really important and why we're doing any of this at all, right? Whether or not it's for our own individual benefit or for something more collective. And so I want you to have this tension sort of in the back of your mind as we dig into this. All right, let's go a little bit further, especially since this talks about some of the other issues that we encounter. Nelson, I know that you had raised your hand to read before. I'd love to have you read for us here.
Rav Yehuda.
No,
said-
sorry, right here.
Oh, the Gemara further asks, and does anyone who performs one mitzvah in addition to his other merits have goodness bestowed upon him in this world? The Gemara raises a contradiction from a Baraita. Anyone whose merits are greater than his sins is punished with suffering in order to cleanse his sins in this world and enable him to merit full reward for his mitzvot in the world to come.
Ooh.
And due to this punishment, he appears to observers like one who burned the entire Torah without leaving even one letter remaining of it. Conversely, anyone whose sins are greater than his merits has goodness bestowed upon him in this world, and he appears like one who has fulfilled the entire Torah without lacking fulfillment of even one letter of it. Without lacking the fulfillment of even one letter of it.
That's wild.
So here is the fundamental question we have about this topic, which is, why do good things happen to bad people? Why do bad
And vice versa.
and vice versa, right? Which is that if we're talking about mitzvot and reward and the world to come, we have this fundamental question, which is we have people who do bad things, seem to have a life totally filled with goodness and reward, and vice versa. And so here the Gemara says, what are we talking about here? What does this really mean? Again, I want you to recognize that in the memory of the Talmud, we have the Rabbinic Martyrs, right, who are murdered by the Romans, right? In relatively recent memory, we have Rabbi Akiva as a classic example, who ostensibly are fulfilling mitzvah after mitzvah, who are being primary examples, right? And their punishment is as if, like, they were getting such a bad punishment. It's as if what is it, the example, right? They burned the entire Torah without leaving even one letter of it remaining, right? Like, if we could, like, that is the worst sin we could possibly imagine. And they are suffering as if they did that, and vice versa, which is that someone who is so sinful, they're getting the benefit as if they were fulfilling every mitzvah. Because this is a challenging question, which is, if we're talking about people who do mitzvot and they're getting this reward, what do we do with this fundamental fact that the world doesn't seem to work that way? Shoshana and then Bill Sadden.
How do you know it's not a ram like in the Abraham-Isaac situation? Perhaps the one who's getting punished is actually the ram. You can't tell. God did it miraculously. And the one who's looks like they're being punished is not really being punished. He's taken out of the way, and a ram is getting the punishment instead.
Well, it does seem to say, I mean, the rabbis do have an example of actual humans in their life who were punished, or that they experienced suffering. So
They were burned alive.
Right, or in the example is right, that they were alive. So I'm not sure who the ram is in the story.
The ram could look identical miraculously to the human.
Yeah, so I don't think that's what the Gemara is saying, in the sense that they're not talking about sort of any miracles that are expanding here. They're talking about people who have experienced suffering and who seem to be good people, and there's a problem there. All right, Bill Sadden.
So, here we're seeing the difficulty when rabbinic authority came into place. I don't want to say supplanting, but augmenting God authority. So when we just had 5 books of Moses that say, and there were mitzvot in there, however poorly defined they were in terms of how we should execute or not, there was clear authority. God says, do this, and that's what we do. And the thought to question too much or to try to understand too much possibly wasn't there. Our temple service was a simple enough service. We burn this, we burn that, we bring offerings, God is happy. Rabbinic Judaism comes along, tries to provide some explanation for some of this, but in the process, we see they introduce, they bring the new apple into the garden, or they bring the new problem in, and that is this idea of the world to come and the idea of reward and punishment. And if you offer reward and punishment, then you have to answer questions such as, why does it not always seem those who are doing bad receive bad, and those who receive doing good receive good? And I think it was a pathway that early rabbinics went down. Christianity took off around the same time and really ran with this whole idea. And I think Judaism kind of saw later on the badness of that approach and kind of left it at a point of, well, we don't really know what happens and we're not really sure, and chose not to push it too far. But I think it's a self-fulfilling problem in that they introduced this idea of the world to come and the idea of reward and punishment. And then that opened up Pandora's box of other questions that they need to now deal with.
I think I would push back on only one piece, which is that I don't think the rabbis invented reward and punishment in the world to come. What I mean to say is, we have evidence of things in the Torah, where we have Sheol and Gehenna, and we have these other things that seem to show up. We have in various places of the Tanakh where people sin, and then there are, there are consequences, right? We have the whole book of Jeremiah would be a manifestation of that worldview, right? So I would agree with you in the sense that we have a problem, which is, if we've got this world to come thing and there's a pathway there, it doesn't seem to be a straight line, and we've got a problem with that. But I would push back to say that the rabbis sort of create a problem and then now have to find a way to solve it. I would also say, just sort of, the history part of ourselves, which is to say, there were lots of worldviews happening in the ancient world and at this time that we can certainly, I'm not a historian, but that there's different ways of that these ideas are floating around, and that some of them get adopted by the rabbis, even if we don't have a direct source. And so, the idea of a world to come and sort of Gehenna and Sheol and these sort of like otherworldly, locations, they do seem to exist, and we obviously see them in other traditions as well. But I do think, right, this fundamental question of what do we do with people who suffer? What happens when we do good things and bad things happen, and vice versa? There's a whole section of Midrash that speaks to this exact issue. This obviously is not specifically about that. It's sort of not specific to suffering, but sort of around this subject that floats around. Ron, and then Sheila, I saw that you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to say why does bad things happen to good people, or vice versa? I'm thinking we only see what we see as humans, and we don't know what's in people's hearts, and we're not the accountant that counts. So, and also, the more righteous you are, the more is expected of you. So the mitzvot don't count as much for a righteous person as they do for a not righteous person. The sin counts more for a righteous person than it does for a normal person. So therefore, it's on a different scale.
So I think, there are evidences of that kind of thinking that show up in other rabbinic places, but I don't think it's here. Which is to say that the rabbis are not making a distinction about levels of righteousness. That's not here. It does show up in other places. I think the Rambam often talks about, as righteous you are, you have greater challenges, things like that. But it's not here. And I think sort of another piece of it is, you're right. We don't know. As human beings, we don't have the evidence. We don't have God sort of the accounting, the ledger, right? We don't have access to God's ledger, if we want to imagine it that way. We have, as human beings, our own observations of seeing, this guy seems like an asshole, and yet he's got everything going for him. Like, what do I do with that? And I think that's what we're seeing. I think that's what we're seeing here. Sheila, and then Nelson.
Well, one of the problems, obviously, is what is the world to come? And you hinted at that before. Now, I have solved the problem for me personally, and it's in one of the tefillot, I think, maybe in the Yisker, where the world to come to me is your reputation. So that would solve the problem that bad people get their uppins after they die. I mean, they may be rich, they may have all their, everything they want now, but later on, we remember them as mamzerim, as we say. They're not good people.
Right. A mamzer is not defined as a bad person, so I want to be careful about that. But right. So if your view, and again, I'm not going to. I certainly have I have my own imagined sense of what the world is for myself as an individual. But if you define, as we are temporarily in this moment, the world to come as our reputation, then this would fit for that. Which is, okay, if somebody is terrible, albeit wealthy, let's say, if we're defining that as reward or long life or one of the other ways, but their reputation is terrible even after death, that's how we remember them, and vice versa.
When we think today of what we're doing with the reputations of people, like all the slave owners, we're throwing out Jefferson, we're throwing out Washington, we throw out everybody. When you think about Sackler and all these other people whose names are being removed from buildings and foundations and whatnot, because they thought they had everything, but now we're not going to give them any kind of credit.
Yeah.
So it is a reputation. I mean, they're getting the world to come right now.
It certainly seems in this view to check those boxes for sure. Nelson.
Let me see. Good. I think the world to come is it's something it's a side issue. It isn't about the world to come. It's about, we see people who are happy and we think they're doing terrible things. How can they be happy and do terrible things? And conversely, we see people who do wondrous things, we think, and have terrible things happen to them, or what we assume to be terrible things. And so we have trouble judging what's valuable and what is valuable to others. And that's really the problem. And we don't read other people's minds. We don't know what they want, but that doesn't answer our question. And part of the question is, what do we want? As I would tell my students when I was teaching, I read that people who win the lottery, terrible things happen to them. I'm willing to risk it.
Yeah,
that's a good example.
So I want to make one important distinction, a piece that you've added here that isn't in the text, and not because it's bad or good, just it's an important, which is happiness, because that's not here. It's described as goodness, long life, inheritance of the world to come. I'm not saying that those things don't include happiness, right? Because we know that happiness and wealth are certainly not aligned, using your example, right? And so we might have to ask ourselves, right? If going back to the Mishnah here, right? What do these things, right? Like these are the rewards, these three things, right? Goodness, a long life, and inheritance of the world to come. And those are tough to define, right? For you, you've defined it as happiness, or at least in this case. And Sheila, you brought in the concept of reputation. But it's not, I don't think it's an obvious answer, at least from the text. And I would argue probably that in context, the rabbis might have a different sense of what those things are defined as we might, as people who are coming 1800 years later. And that isn't to say I'm ascribing or suggesting we ascribe to a particular definition, but there's an important question there, right, in terms of how this is defined. Shoshana, Bill, and then Sheila, and then we're going to end.
Doesn't world to come have to do with times of the Messiah?
It does, and I'm gonna hold that because it comes up in this section of Talmud, and I don't want to spoil it.
And I
but yes,
wanted to say God must have mercy, and if you haven't done well enough, hopefully He's compassionate, merciful enough for you to have time to make up for everything that you didn't do right.
Yeah, I mean, and certainly there are good questions about what does God's goodness really mean. Rabbi Brad Artson, my teacher, often says God, this is not quite in response to what you're saying, but that God can be all powerful or all good, but not both. And again, whether or not you agree or disagree notwithstanding, there are real challenges, real questions about how this system, as it were, seems to function. And certainly there is a view that God's doing the final accounting, and if you haven't been good, you're up to God's mercy to see if whether or not you make it to whatever conclusion there might be.
Yom Kippur.
Right, Yom Kippur is a piece of this puzzle as well, right? As what we do as human beings in this world, as a part of realigning ourselves to who we might hope to be. Bill, and then Sheila, and then we're going to call it a day.
So yeah, going back to the three things here, goodness is bestowed upon him. I assume the bestower is God. I don't know if we're to accept it that way. His life is lengthened. Again, I'm assuming God is lengthening their life. But the next one is he inherits the land. It's not the land is given to them. So inherits the land. Does that go back to the idea that as Jews, we were promised, we have a covenantal tie to the land and we're to inherit it. But if that's the case, then how can it be in the balance? How could it be that we have the covenant, but we don't necessarily always inherit it based on the covenant? So if you could give some clarity to those ideas, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, so I mean, if we look at these texts here in the Hebrew, mitivin, sorry, it is and ma'arichin, those are hefil verbs, those are causative verbs. So it doesn't say who's doing the causing. It would arguably, I think God is probably as good of a guess as we can have for the other. It is interesting about inherits. Inherits in Hebrew in this case is nochel, which is not passive, right? It is an action, right? But it is something that's happening to the subject or the object of the sentence, and not to the subject. So it doesn't seem to say that God is inheriting. It does seem to have a conflict as to how we've defined land here and why the rabbis are redefining it, perhaps, right? Which is to say, actually, we're not talking about land. We're not talking about real land. We're talking about something else as a way of resolving that problem. I don't have any better answer than that, which is to say, I think the rabbis are struggling with this answer.
Well, this comes again after the destruction of the temple, the loss of Jerusalem, the idea that we actually are able to inherit that land. So maybe they've got to redefine what the land means. Maybe next year in Jerusalem isn't next year in physical Jerusalem, for example.
And I would also just add that the rabbis were really, really happy in Babylonia. Like they were not particularly, certainly some, but not everybody was particularly inclined to go and make aliyah. that living a diaspora life was a preferred outcome. Again, I'm trying not to paint with a broad brush. There are lots of views within the tradition, and maybe we'll spend some time with those. But here, certainly the rabbis are inclined to redefine land to mean something other than something physical. All right, Sheila, real quick, last word.
This is sort of beside the point, but it raises the question of happiness. Am I correct? I know we talk about Hasameach Bechelko, but are we also, the emphasis in Judaism is not on happiness. Is this correct?
Right. So Sameach Bechelko, meaning, right, one is happy with their
One
portion,
is satisfied.
right, with what they have. Yeah, I mean, the question of happiness is a really deep philosophical one, of which I certainly am no expert. But I do think Sameach does matter, right, to Judaism. Like, happiness does matter, joy does matter. We say, right, Misameach Chatan v'Kala, right? We say we should,
Okay.
we want to
Yeah,
make the two people who are being married, we want them to be joyous. In fact, it's incumbent on us to make the attempt. And so, because I'm not disagreeing, but I am suggesting that, right, the end goal of Judaism, not that there really is one, would not seem to be joy, but it's not joy either, right? It's still
It's
certainly
not the ultimate. In other words, it's not the ultimate goal.
right. So Judaism doesn't really function with those kinds of goal language. It doesn't really work that way. We don't have like a goal. We're not saved, but certainly joy is, right. That's why mahadrim in a mahadrim. We want to make it joyous. We want to beautify the mitzvot. It's not. We want to give more of ourselves in those moments. And so we're this is our first day in this deep dive. We'll be back next week to go a little bit further and see where this text takes us. I hope all of you are well rewarded with a wonderful Shabbat this upcoming weekend, and we'll see you next week, Thursday at noon Eastern. Be well, everybody.
Yeah,